Iran just launched ballistic missiles at U.S. forces in the Middle East. And if you're just tuning in, no, this isn't old footage. This isn't a rerun of something from earlier this year. This is happening right now. At 5:45 p.m. Eastern Time, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps fired multiple ballistic missiles in what U.S. Central Command is calling an attempted surprise attack on American forces based in the region. And here's the part that should make every single one of you sit up a little straighter in your chair. Every single missile was intercepted. Not most of them, not the majority, all of them. Zero got through. So before we even get into the how and the why, just take a second and appreciate that sentence, because that sentence represents years of engineering, billions of dollars, and crews standing watch on ships in the middle of the night so that regular people back home can go about their day without thinking twice about it. Now let's actually break down what happened, because there's a lot more going on underneath the surface than just missiles going up and missiles coming down. A senior U.S. official told reporters that the missiles were aimed at an American base in Jordan, though CENTCOM itself, in its official statement, only said the missiles targeted U.S. forces based in the Middle East without naming the specific location. That's pretty standard operational security, by the way. You don't always want to confirm exactly where you got hit or where your defenses just performed, because that gives the enemy a scorecard. But between the senior official leaks and the pattern of Iran's recent behavior, Jordan lines up. This is the same country where American service members were killed earlier this month in a missile and drone strike. So Iran going back to the same well isn't exactly shocking. It's actually kind of predictable at this point, and that's the frustrating thing about dealing with a regime like this. They don't really have a diverse playbook. They've got ballistic missiles, they've got drones, and they've got a Twitter account full of threats. That's about it. Here's where it gets almost darkly funny if you sit with it for a second. This attack landed on the exact same day that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was sitting down with President Trump inside the Oval Office. Same day that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also had a closed-door meeting with Trump. Two of the most consequential foreign leaders on the planet, both in Washington, both talking about how to handle hostile regimes, and Iran decided that was the perfect moment to lob missiles at American troops. You almost have to respect the audacity, except audacity isn't really the right word for cowardice dressed up as strength. Because let's be honest about what this is. This is a regime that knows it can't win a conventional fight, so it reaches for the one tool it still has, mass-produced ballistic missiles, and fires them hoping something, anything, gets through and gives them a headline. It's theater. It's leverage. It's a middle finger time for maximum visibility. And once again, it didn't work. The Netanyahu meeting itself was described by people close to it as one of the best conversations the two leaders have had. Netanyahu called it an excellent and comprehensive discussion, first and foremost about Iran, and said the two sides reaffirmed what he called an ironclad commitment to making sure Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. That meeting happened behind closed doors in the Oval Office, no press invited in, no joint statement to cameras afterward, which itself tells you something. When these meetings go well, and there's nothing sensitive to hide, you usually get a little photo op, a wave, maybe a thumbs up. When it's this locked down, it usually means the conversation covered operational details that nobody wants leaking into a headline before the right moment. This was reportedly the 8th meeting between Trump and Netanyahu since Trump returned to office, and by multiple accounts, it focused heavily on the alleged expansion of a nuclear facility deep inside Iran's mountains, one that intelligence analysts have been tracking closely for months. We'll get into exactly what that facility is here in a bit, because it matters a lot for where this conflict goes next. But first, if you're new to the channel or you've just stumbled into the middle of this, let's rewind, because the context here actually explains everything happening tonight. This war didn't start today. It didn't start last week. It started on February 28th of this year, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign against the Iranian regime called Operation Epic Fury. In the span of about 12 hours, U.S. and Israeli forces conducted nearly 900 strikes across Iran, hitting missile production facilities, air defense networks, military infrastructure, and regime leadership. And when I say leadership, I mean the top of the top. That opening wave of strikes killed Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, the man who had sat at the top of that regime for decades, killed in a strike on his own compound. Think about that for a second. Decades of propping up a theocratic dictatorship, decades of funding proxy militias and chanting death to America, and it ended with a piece of precision-guided ordnance finding him exactly where he thought he was safest. That opening barrage triggered a massive Iranian retaliation. Hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones went out across the region in the days that followed, hitting targets not just tied to the US and Israel, but spreading chaos into countries that had almost nothing to do with the conflict directly. The United Arab Emirates got hit. Retaliation strikes there killed 3 foreign workers and injured dozens more. British military facilities got targeted across 3 different regions: Cyprus, the the Indian Ocean, and Iraq, because Iran considers anyone cooperating with U.S. forces to be fair game. Jordan got hit, which is why tonight's attack landed there again. The Strait of Hormuz got closed entirely for a stretch, choking off one of the most important oil choke points on the planet. Missile debris even struck a hotel in Dubai. This wasn't a contained surgical exchange between two militaries. This was a regime lashing out in every direction it possibly could, because that's what cornered regimes do. They don't calculate. They flail. After 40 days of sustained combat, a ceasefire took hold back in April, and for a while it looked like the region might actually get a breather. But peace with a regime like this one never really holds, does it? Because the fundamental problem was never resolved. Iran's nuclear ambitions didn't disappear just because a ceasefire got signed on a piece of paper. In June, both sides agreed to a memorandum of understanding aimed at reopening the Strait of Hormuz and formally ending the war. And for about a month, it looked like it might stick. Then Iran, being Iran, decided that a memorandum of understanding was more of a suggestion than an actual commitment. They started asserting what basically amounted to hegemonic control over the strait, demanding that ships follow pre-approved routes and pay fees to pass through waters that are supposed to be international. When ships didn't comply, or maybe just because they felt like flexing, Iranian forces opened fire on multiple commercial vessels in early July. That's what broke the fragile peace and brought us right back to where we are tonight. Except this time, the United States has had months to study exactly how Iran operates, exactly where it hides its inventory, and exactly what its remaining capability actually looks like. So let's talk about that capability, because Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth made some pretty bold claims back in March, saying Iran's defense industrial base was nearing what he called complete destruction, and that its ballistic missile production capacity had been functionally defeated. Strong words. The kind of words that make good headlines. But here's the thing about strong words in wartime. Reality has a way of humbling them. Iran's own defense ministry, through state-linked media, has been openly claiming that its production lines are, in their words, more active than ever, and that strikes on strategic defense facilities failed to actually halt weapons production. Now, obviously, you take anything coming out of a regime-controlled press outlet with a mountain of salt, because propaganda is basically their national pastime at this point. But tonight's missile launch is a pretty inconvenient data point for anyone who claimed this capability was completely gone. You don't fire what you don't have. Hegseth actually got pressed on this exact contradiction at a Senate hearing last week, and notably, he didn't directly reaffirm his earlier claim when given the chance. That's the kind of moment that tells you more than any press release ever could. So, what does Iran actually still have in the tank? Reports circulating right now suggest that Iran entered this conflict with somewhere around 5,000 ballistic missiles in its inventory and has burned through a significant chunk of that, leaving somewhere in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 remaining. On the drone side, estimates put their starting stockpile at roughly 50,000 units, now down to somewhere around 10,000. That's still not nothing. That's still enough to keep launching harassment strikes, enough to keep threatening shipping lanes, enough to keep American and allied forces on a heightened alert posture for the foreseeable future. But it's a shrinking arsenal being fired at a defense network that just proved, again, tonight, that it can go a perfect zero for however many missiles came its way. Every strike Iran launches now is spinning down a finite resource against a system that isn't running out of intercept capability anytime soon. That math doesn't favor them, and deep down, I think even their own commanders know it. Let's talk about how the interception itself actually works, because this is the stuff that doesn't always make it into the headlines, but honestly deserves way more credit than it gets. When a ballistic missile launches from Iranian soil, you're looking at a multi-layered defense architecture working in real time. You've got space-based and ground-based sensors detecting the launch within seconds, tracking the trajectory, feeding that data to command centers that calculate an intercept solution almost instantly. Then you've got naval assets, guided missile destroyers and cruisers positioned throughout the region, capable of launching interceptors like the SM-3 and SM-6 to hit the missile, either in its mid-course phase or during terminal descent. On land, you've got Patriot batteries providing another layer, and depending on positioning, THAAD systems adding yet another. It's not one system doing all the work, it's a layered net. And the whole point of layering it is that if one layer has a gap, the next one catches it. CENTCOM currently has more than 20 U.S. Navy warships operating across the Middle East, and a huge part of their job right now isn't offense. It's this exact kind of defense, standing ready every single night to catch whatever Iran decides to throw. And can we just take a second to talk about the blockade, because this is honestly one of the more underrated storylines of the entire war right now. CENTCOM has been running what they're calling a steel wall blockade against Iran. And as of today, they've redirected 18 commercial vessels, disabled 2 and boarded 2, all to enforce compliance with sanctions and prevent Iran from moving illicit cargo through the region. Think about the scale of that for a second. This isn't just missile defense. This is an active, ongoing maritime operation, squeezing Iran's ability to move money, oil, and weapons in and out of the country. Every tanker that gets redirected is potential revenue Iran doesn't get. Every disabled vessel is a message that the ocean isn't a safe smuggling route anymore. And this pressure campaign is compounding, because Iran is also dealing with the fallout of oil sales being restricted directly by the Trump administration. You put those two things together, a naval blockade squeezing legitimate and illegitimate shipping alike, plus a direct ban on oil sales, and you start to understand why Iran is genuinely entering what looks like panic mode behind the scenes. They need money to keep this fight going, and that money is getting harder and harder to find. Now let's get back to what Netanyahu and Trump were actually discussing today, because it ties directly into where this whole thing might be heading next. Multiple reports indicate the conversation centered heavily on Iran's continued expansion of a deeply buried facility that intelligence analysts have been referring to as Pickax Mountain. This is a tunnel complex carved into mountainous terrain, reportedly under construction and expansion for years, engineered specifically to survive the kind of bunker buster strikes that took out Iran's previous nuclear sites earlier in this conflict. If that intelligence is accurate, and there's a growing body of satellite and open source analysis suggesting it is, then this facility represents Iran's attempt to learn from getting hit and build something that can actually take the next punch. And that's exactly the kind of target that brings B-2 stealth bombers and 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs back into the conversation. Because remember, this administration has already shown it's willing to use those weapons once. The question tonight isn't whether the United States has the capability to hit a target like that again. Everybody in the region already knows the answer to that. The question is timing, and tonight's missile attacks, landing on the exact day these two leaders sat down to discuss exactly this facility, might not be a coincidence at all. It might be Iran trying to get a shot in before the hammer potentially comes down again. Let's shift over to Saudi Arabia for a second, because there's another thread of this story that deserves attention and doesn't get nearly enough of it. Saudi Arabia carried out what it called limited, targeted strikes alongside the United States against Iran-backed militias operating inside Iraq, specifically ones linked to recent attacks on Saudi oil facilities. Before that, Saudi forces intercepted and destroyed several drones that had been launched from Iraq, targeting oil infrastructure in the eastern part of the kingdom. What this tells you is that Iran's proxy network, the whole hub-and-spoke model of arming and funding militias across Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, and elsewhere to do its dirty work without direct fingerprints, is still very much active, but it's also increasingly getting called out and punished directly. Saudi Arabia getting involved militarily, even in a limited capacity, is a genuinely significant shift, because for a long time the Gulf states tried to stay out of direct kinetic operations against Iranian proxies, preferring quiet diplomacy and behind-the-scenes pressure. That era appears to be ending. When you've got Saudi fighter jets flying combat missions against Iranian proxies in coordination with the US, you're looking at a regional coalition that's forming in real time against Tehran. And Iran's options for keeping this contained to a US-Israel problem are shrinking fast. If you're finding this breakdown useful, do me a favor and drop a comment letting me know where you think this goes next, because I want to see what you all think before I lay out my own read on it later. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit subscribe, because a night like tonight is exactly the kind of situation that can escalate or de-escalate within hours, and you don't want to miss the follow-up if something major happens overnight. Let's talk a little more about Iran's own public messaging, because it's honestly one of the more revealing parts of tonight's story. Iran's acting Minister of Defense and Armed Forces Logistics told a semi-official news agency closely tied to the Revolutionary Guard that defense industry production lines are more active than ever, and that strikes on strategic facilities fail to halt weapons production. That's the official line. Everything's fine, nothing's slowing down, don't worry about us. Except if everything really were fine, you wouldn't need to say it publicly with that much emphasis. Confident people and confident regimes don't usually feel the need to reassure the world that they're still capable. That's a tell. That's the equivalent of someone insisting they're not mad while their voice is shaking. And it lines up with a pattern we've seen from this regime the entire war. Announce defiance publicly, insist nothing has changed, then quietly absorb another round of losses, while the propaganda machine spins it as resilience. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic side, there's actually been a small but interesting development involving Ukraine. Ukraine's foreign minister had what was described as a frank phone call with his Iranian counterpart, stressing the need to avoid what he called unnecessary escalation. That's diplomatic language for please stop making our lives more complicated than they already are, because Ukraine has its own reasons to be nervous about Iran right now, mainly tied to Iran's drone and weapons relationship with Russia, which has been one of the more undercovered threads of global conflict this year. Iran has been a key supplier of Shahed-style drones and other weaponry to Russia throughout the Ukraine war, and any escalation in the Middle East runs the risk of further entangling these two theaters that a lot of casual observers still think of as completely separate conflicts. They're not separate. They're increasingly the same fight playing out on two different maps, with Iran, Russia, and their respective proxies on one side, and the US, Israel, Ukraine, and a growing coalition of Gulf partners on the other. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about why any of this actually matters to you if you're sitting at home watching this unfold. It's easy to think of this as a distant regional conflict that doesn't touch your life directly, but that's simply not accurate anymore. The Strait of Hormuz, that Iran has been threatening and periodically closing, carries a massive percentage of the entire world's seaborne oil trade through a choke point that's barely more than 20 miles wide at its narrowest. Every time Iran threatens that strait, every time a tanker gets attacked or a blockade tightens, that ripples straight into gas prices, shipping costs, and eventually the price of nearly everything that gets moved by container ship, which, let's be honest, is almost everything you own. This isn't some abstract geopolitical chess match happening far away with no consequences. When Iran plays games in the Strait of Hormuz, your wallet feels it within weeks. And there's the human cost too, which never gets talked about enough in the middle of all this technical missile defense breakdown. 18 US service members have been killed in this conflict so far, real people with families, people who signed up to defend this country and paid the ultimate price doing it. On the Iranian side, the human toll has been staggering as well. Hundreds killed in the opening strikes alone back in February, including a devastating strike on a girls' school that claimed dozens of young lives, a tragedy that both sides have used for very different narratives, but that represents real grief regardless of which side of the conflict you're on. War is genuinely awful, and nobody watching this should walk away thinking otherwise. The goal of covering this isn't to glorify any of it. It's to help you actually understand what's happening and why. Because an informed public makes better decisions than a public that's just absorbing chaotic headlines with no context. Let's get back to the here and now, because there's a broader strategic picture forming that I think is worth laying out clearly. The stated goal of this entire campaign from the American side has never wavered, not once, since Operation Epic Fury launched back in February. Iran cannot be allowed to possess a nuclear weapon. Full stop. Not a reduced program. Not enhanced inspections. Not a watered-down deal that lets them keep enriching uranium under some new label. The floor has consistently been zero nuclear capability, and every single major military action since then has been built around enforcing that line. The International Atomic Energy Agency has previously confirmed that a significant amount of Iran's highly enriched uranium, material that could theoretically be further enriched to weapons grade, is believed to still be stored in hardened tunnels somewhere in that same mountainous region tied to the Natanz nuclear complex. If that assessment holds up, and if Pickax Mountain really is where that material is being protected, then you start to understand why this facility has become the single most important target on the entire strategic map right now. Here's something else worth understanding, because it explains why this conflict keeps flaring back up instead of just ending cleanly. Iran's entire negotiating strategy from day one has been to use ballistic missiles and drone strikes as leverage chips. Every time talks stall, or every time Iran wants to signal that it hasn't been fully neutralized, out come the missiles. It's almost transactional at this point. Launch a strike, generate a headline, remind the world you're still relevant, then go back to the negotiating table with a little more perceived leverage than you had yesterday. Except this strategy has a fatal flaw baked right into it, and tonight proved it once again. Every single missile they fire either gets intercepted, which accomplishes nothing except burning through their dwindling inventory, or in the rare unfortunate case that one does get through, it just invites a heavier response than whatever came before it. There is no version of this strategy that actually improves Iran's position long term. It's a regime playing checkers against an opponent playing a much longer game, and every move they make just seems to tighten the noose a little further. So where does this actually go from here? Let's talk strategic analysis for a second, because I think there are really only a couple of realistic paths forward. Path 1. The tactical pause that's been happening around Hormuz gets fully abandoned, and the United States resumes major combat operations to finish off what's been described as the remaining target sets that weren't fully addressed during the earlier campaign. That would almost certainly mean renewed strikes on facilities like Pickax Mountain, using next-generation bunker buster capability that the Air Force has reportedly been fast-tracking, specifically because the original 30,000-pound penetrator might not be enough to crack a target buried potentially thousands of feet into solid granite. Path 2. Cooler heads find some way to drag this back toward the negotiating table one more time, probably brokered through Gulf intermediaries like Oman, who have played this role before, resulting in another shaky ceasefire that may or may not hold any better than the last one did. Given the pattern we've seen all year, Ceasefires with this regime seem to have a shelf life measured in weeks, not months. So even if Path 2 happens, don't be surprised if we're right back here talking about another missile attack sometime soon. There's also a third variable that a lot of analysts aren't weighing heavily enough, and that's the growing regional coalition forming against Iran that goes beyond just the US and Israel. You've got Saudi Arabia now taking direct military action. You've got the UAE deepening its security and intelligence cooperation with American forces. You've got smaller Gulf states quietly providing targeting support and access. The more this coalition solidifies, the less Iran's old playbook of playing regional powers off against each other actually works. For decades, part of Iran's strategic advantage was exploiting the fact that its neighbors were often too divided or too cautious to act collectively against it. That advantage appears to be eroding in real time. And if it keeps eroding, Iran's strategic isolation is only going to deepen, which historically tends to make cornered regimes either fold or lash out even harder before they fold. Tonight might have been an example of the second option. Let's also touch on something that doesn't get enough attention, which is what happens to Iran's own population through all of this. Remember, this entire conflict didn't start in a vacuum. It followed massive protests inside Iran back in January, protests that the Revolutionary Guard responded to with brutal crackdowns across more than 100 cities, killing thousands of demonstrators who were simply asking for a different life than the one this regime has forced on them for decades. That's the part that I think gets lost sometimes when we're deep in the missile defense weeds and the satellite imagery breakdowns. This isn't really a fight between America and the Iranian people. It's a fight against a regime that has spent enormous resources building underground missile cities and hardened nuclear bunkers, while its own citizens deal with economic collapse, oppression, and a government that would rather murder its own protesters than listen to them. If you ever wonder why there was so much global sympathy for regime change earlier this year, remember that January crackdown. Because that's the context a lot of casual observers miss. Let's bring it back to tonight one more time, because I want to make sure the full picture is clear before we wrap this up. Iran launched ballistic missiles at American forces in the Middle East, almost certainly targeting the base in Jordan again. Every single missile was intercepted by US defenses, continuing a streak that should honestly be getting way more recognition than it does. This happened on the same day that Netanyahu and Trump held what both sides described as one of the most positive and productive meetings they've had throughout this entire war, a meeting centered heavily on the Pickax Mountain facility and Iran's continued nuclear ambitions. It also happened on the same day Trump met separately with Ukraine's president, another reminder of just how interconnected these global flashpoints have become. Meanwhile, the blockade around Iran continues tightening, the coalition against Tehran continues growing, and Iran's own stockpiles of missiles and drones continue shrinking with every wasted launch. None of that adds up to a regime that's winning. It adds up to a regime that's running out of road and firing missiles mostly to remind the world it's still there. What do you think happens next? Do you think the tactical pause around the strait holds, or do you think we're about to see renewed strikes on that mountain facility in the very near future? I'd genuinely love to hear your take in the comments, because this community has had some incredibly sharp analysis in past discussions, and I always learn something from reading through what you all bring to the table. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what's happening tonight, instead of just seeing a scary headline scroll by, do me a favor and share it with someone who's been asking you what's going on over there. Because half the value of these updates is making sure more people actually understand the full picture instead of just the panic-inducing 30-second clip. And if you want to stay ahead of this as it develops, because it is developing fast and it could look completely different by tomorrow morning, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next update the moment something changes. Thanks so much for watching. Stay safe out there, and we'll keep tracking this one closely.